The following lesson is from Security Plus SY0-201 Learn Smart video training. To find out how you can get unlimited access to our entire Learn Smart video training library, call 1-800-418-6789.
Security requirements is a very important topic within the Security Plus exam and in any type of secure implementation. Security requirements help you to determine exactly what security technologies you should be utilizing. Remember, Bruce Schneier says, security is a trade-off. Anytime we implement a security technology, we lose something. We may lose ease of access, we may lose access altogether, and so on. So it is very, very important that we understand the true requirements of our system before we start implementing various security technologies. We could say then that the first step to securing our systems is requirements analysis. And requirements depend on a number of different things. First of all, we have to look at the sensitivity of information. Not all information is as sensitive as all other information. Some of the data files that we have in our organization will have very sensitive information related to our clients or partner organizations. And other data files will have that standard information in them that we would make available on our website or in an email or any other location. So we have to understand the sensitivity of the information. Then we want to look at the cost of our assets. Not all assets are equally valuable. I would not want to spend thousands of dollars in order to protect a wireless access point that only cost me $200. That's the key factor. However, I also have to think about these things in balance. For example, if I implement secure entry to my facility, I'm protecting more than just that one wireless access point. So while the secure entry may cost me tens of thousands of dollars, the reality is I'm protecting everything in that building cumulatively. And so I have to look at the value of those assets together. So asset valuation is important. Next, we need to consider the objectives. We have objectives that we have to look at really from two different perspectives. So we want to make sure we consider the users and the business objectives. Then we need to remember that requirements analysis is really a process. This isn't something you're going to go in and do and then just be done with it. But it's a repeated process. We go back and look at the requirements on a regular basis to make sure we're actually still meeting the demands of the organization, because demands do change. Here's the big secret. In order to determine what your data is actually worth, you need to have some method of classification. You have to be able to look at that information and place it in a category or a class of information that determines its value. Now remember, value does not just come from the cost of losing the data. It does also come from the loss if your competitors gain that data or information. So classification becomes very important to us. Classification of information helps to determine the sensitivity of data as well. And this is really the way in which we usually classify it, by simply specifying different levels of sensitivity. Information classes are varied, and they include public, internal, and restricted. We see that the majority of our information fits into this internal category. Now, the internal category of information is going to be broken into two parts. There will be that internal information that's accessible to everyone within our organization, and then there will be that very sensitive internal information that only a select few people are allowed to access. But this is the concept then of data classification. It allows us to look at our information, determine what it's worth, put it in the right category, and then secure that category of data in an appropriate way. One thing that is very important with data is that you have the ability to prove you've handled that data effectively. You need to be able to prove in court cases, in HR scenarios where the Human Resources Department is dealing with an employee problem, and in other such scenarios that you have handled data appropriately. This concept is known as due care. When we talk about due care, we're talking about information handling. And it's defined under your guidelines for due care. So you need to have standard operating procedures that specify these guidelines. The goal of due care then is to protect a number of different important things. First of all, we want to make sure that we're dealing with customer information appropriately. Customer information is valuable to you, but guess who it's also valuable to? Your customers, exactly. They don't want this information getting out and into the wrong hands. This is why it's so important to us, for example, when we fill out a form on a website, that it tells us our information will not be shared with anyone else. So we want to make sure we're handling customer information effectively. In addition, we want to make sure we're dealing with patient records effectively. You might say that patient records are really a unique subcategory of customer information, since the patients are effectively customers of the hospital. But patient records are even more important still, because there are very specific regulations in most countries that deal with how you should handle patient records. For example, in the United States, we have the Health Information Privacy Act, or HIPAA regulation, that specifies how we should deal with this information. We also have legal information. Legal information would include any kind of documentation that is legal in nature, and we need to make sure we have standard operating procedures in place for dealing with it. And finally, there is financial information. You've probably heard a lot over the last few years about something called Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX for short. This is just one of the things that we have to deal with in relation to financial information. Another one that's interesting, and we're starting to see more states implement such regulations, is the legislation that was passed in California, which simply says that if you have any information about a citizen of California stored in your database, you have to encrypt it and put measures in place to help protect that information. If you do not, you could be subject to legal fines. Other states are also looking at passing similar information. So this is very, very important that we deal with this information effectively. Remember that courts may actually require proof of due care. This means that you're going to need documentation that outlines the way you handle data. This documentation can be presented to the court, and the court can use that to determine whether or not they may want to seize different hardware devices that you have that have data stored on those devices and so forth in an investigation scenario. So we want to be able to prove due care in scenarios like this. In addition to proving due care, that you're handling data effectively, you need to think about a concept known as due diligence. Due diligence indicates that you've put the appropriate effort into implementing and managing your due care procedures. So we have to make sure we can prove that we're actually doing what we need to do. Due diligence then means that individuals are not negligent in carrying out their duties. So this comes down to an individual level. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or SOX, requires the implementation of due diligence in different ways. First of all, it requires risk assessments. The requirement of a risk assessment is really simple. You have to prove, if you're a publicly traded organization, that you have measures in place to look for risks in your organization. You have to prove that you're watching out for the potential problems that should occur, so that you are not going to find yourself blindsided by something that you should have been aware of. So risk assessment is part of this process. But in addition to risk assessment, we also have internal controls. This indicates that we have the proper procedures and systems in place within our organization to ensure that our data is appropriately protected, to ensure that risks are less likely than they would otherwise be. So this is about internal controls. You're not just letting anyone within the organization access any information that you have. In addition to internal controls, we need to make sure that we have auditing procedures in place. This proves that we're logging what happens on our network. In addition to Sarbanes-Oxley, we also have the Computer Security Act of 1987. This is a specific act for federal agencies, which requires that they have security policies. In other words, this act put in place the laws that say that any federal agency is going to